one thing to get an editor mad at you, but when you know a president is presidents are genuinely pissed.
Yeah. Well, that's good for business.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's just good for business.
But what's interesting about George Bush doesn't like you, right, W?
Right, but he learned from his father. His father was very outspoken about his distaste for the strip, and he would bring the subject up. He'd come on a show like this, and it would be the first thing out of his mouth, which is very unpresidential, and it elevated me way beyond my importance in the national conversation. I loved it, but people began to wonder, why has he allowed this cartoonist to get under his skin? Now, his son, when he became president, made a point of not personalizing his critics. Right. He did not identify them. I can't think of an exception to that. He was very disciplined in certain ways, George Bush.
But you also, didn't you go to school with him? You're like a couple years behind him?
A couple years behind him,
What kind of student was George W. Bush?
Well, I mean, all the news accounts say he was a mediocre student. I wasn't keeping track of his academic performance.
But do you remember him and his group of guys?
I do. I mean, he was in the Animal House. He was the... He was the president of the Deke fraternity, which was the athlete fraternity house, and is
that code for he was in the Skulls? Is that what that was?
No, that was the Skull and Bones was a senior society. This was just a regular fraternity, and where we first crossed paths was I got a call from the student newspaper and said, well, we have this big expose coming up this week in the paper. And I said, what is it? And he said, well, it turns out that the Deke fraternity is branding its initiates with red-hot coat irons. And we have photographs of the Delta seared into the flesh of the buttocks of their initiates. And I went, wow, that's interesting. So I started doing some cartoons, and then that whole thing appeared, and it was this big scandal, and it kind of rolled along, and it picked up national attention. New York Times sent up a reporter. And then Bush was rolled out to deal with it because he was the president. Yeah. And he wasn't the Rush chairman at that point. He graduated to president.
So he was into torture even back then?
That's where I was going with this. You see, is that his first interview he gave in the national press was in defense of torture.